We had dedicated a memorial in Canberra to the SAS people that had been killed in Vietnam and in training. On this occasion, when we dedicated our memorial, all of the next of kin of some 42 SAS soldiers attended the service, and as they came up to place their roses on the memorial, they came up and stood by me. And it was a bright sunny day. They all had their glasses on and they were crying. The next of kin, the families, the wives and their children, dated from the Borneo days to people that were in their late 40s and 50s, down to the Black Hawk widows in their 20s. And I think that triggered it. I just found that impossible to cope with. And it was only days after that that I found I had problems. And so 33 years after the war, I became a casualty. And all of my soldiers. All of my soldiers have done that. I feel responsible for them still. And I now feel really compelled to get back in touch with them all and help them. Because I think they need me now more than ever.
Every war has its own story to tell. Of lives lost on the battlefield, and lives changed forever at home. But from the start, the war in Vietnam was destined to be different.
We're at the Sydney Town Hall on the corner of George Street and Park Street.
It was a war that had the power to divide ordinary Australian men and women. And it prompted citizens who'd never protested in their lives to take to the streets. Vietnam weakened our strong ties with an important friend as we went to war for the first time without them. We answered the call from a new and demanding ally, and we fought in a war that would never be won. Vietnam was a war that, for a while, caused us to forget those countrymen and women who put their lives at risk for our nation.
It's been said, probably by someone much wiser than me, that the soldiers win the battles, but the politicians win the wars or lose the wars. And Vietnam is no different. The politicians sent the soldiers in. We were not very well equipped. We were not very well supported. We won the battles. We lost the war.
Morality had nothing to do with it. We were there for purely pragmatic reasons, and I could understand that. The Americans said, for Christ's sake, look, you lean on us for your security, whether it's proper or not. You lean on us for your security. Therefore, we want you there. You know, we've got a lot of brownie points with your country, and now you owe us.
It wasn't simply a response to brownie points owed that sent our troops to Vietnam. The Communist North had attacked the American-backed South. We feared that if Vietnam fell to the rising force of the Communists, then like dominoes, neighboring Asian countries would also fall. The falling dominoes would lead the Communist threat to our shores. Our commitment was a token one at first. No combat, just an army training team to teach the South Vietnamese how to fight the good fight against communism.
G'day. Ciao, Em.
But even in those early, naive days, the lies, secrets, and double-dealing that were to characterize this conflict were already in operation. For the Americans, winning was everything, as a young Australian officer found out firsthand when he was sent to the Central Highlands of Vietnam by the CIA. He was to train the Vietnamese hill tribes, called the Montagnard, to fight the Viet Cong. But Captain Peterson's mistake was that he was too successful. And this success drew another CIA assignment, to take part in a widespread program of assassinations.
I said, if anyone has to be knocked off, I have the men to do it. And from time to time we do it. But no way do I want to create a special force of assassins. I called it a Frankenstein monster. I said, no, I won't be in it. I said, we'll cope and we'll knock off people who are positively identified as agents, enemy agents, but no professional assassins.
The program called Phoenix was ultimately effective, but inevitably abused.
A lot of innocent people died. A lot of people who, for some reason or other, government officials had grudges against them and decided to get rid of them. And of course they'd used this Phoenix program by pointing them out as communists. It's very much like McCarthyism in the States. Somebody's named and they're blacklisted because they're suspected of being a communist. Except in Vietnam, of course, they were killed.
Captain Peterson's refusal to join Phoenix almost spelt his demise. The CIA simply added his name to the death list.
All they had to do was cut off the flow of money and weapons, and that would have been enough to get rid of me. It would have been made to look like an accident and I would die a hero's death, which sounded a bit stupid to me. But I think it was really very much like Apocalypse Now. If he won't come out, if he won't leave the Highlands, we'll get rid of him.
Captain Peterson was a member of a unique Australian training team. They were the longest-serving Australian unit in Vietnam, the first in and the last to leave. They were the most decorated unit of any in our wars, with 4 Victoria Crosses awarded for exceptional courage. Thousands of fellow soldiers followed in their path.
A is for Aussie, the salt of the earth, a fearless soldier, but he's full of mirth. B is for Bamooey, bar a noggy drink, a glass down your throat and your guts down the sink. C is for Charlie, the elusive VC. He hides in the jungle, but he can't hide from me. D is for Digger, the bravest of all. He sells his life dearly at his country's call.
Australian regular soldiers followed the training team and began tours of duty in Vietnam. They entered the most technologically sophisticated conflict yet seen. New American methods of killing were tested and refined for the first time in the heat of battle in Vietnam. Like toxic warfare, that did not always discriminate between enemy and ally. There were two parts to the American equation for success: firepower and body counts. The Americans killed more Viet Cong, but suffered many more casualties for their successes than the Australians did.
We were absolutely terrified to be moving along with a large group of Americans with their rifles over their shoulders, talking, some with radios playing as they went out, and they would wander off into the night and set up their ambushes or their listening patrols, and we would have to try to settle down and anxiously wait out the night with them. We continued to operate in a very stealthy manner in the way that we moved through the jungle, looking for the enemy and then fighting him on our terms rather than drawing them to us as the Americans did.
There was a collective sigh of relief when the Australians were given their own turf to build a task force base. And with it came a sense of independence. They now had a chance to work in their own way, relying on stealthy patrolling and patience in finding and confronting the enemy. Australian soldiers dug into what was to be their home for more than 5 years, the province of Phuoc Tuy.
I have got a story that I would like to tell. It's a tale of death and glory, nerves, fear and hell. Words can't convey the feeling of the man this tale's about. He's a silent man moving up that track. He's the lonely Ford Scout. He's just an Aussie soldier this tale is all about. He's the silent man moving up that track. He's the lonely Ford Scout.
During their time here, Australian soldiers would adapt to the climate and the terrain and distinguish themselves in the heart of this renowned Viet Cong stronghold. The daily life was as routine as any other war. Village searches, ambushes, bunker destructions, and endless patrols. But the monotony was to be broken sharply, just 3 months into their stay. Australian troops are unwinding at the end of the day, unaware that tonight 24 of them will be wounded. The Australian task force base is to be attacked for the first time. A fierce and bloody battle called Long Tan will follow, and these soldiers will realize that they face a committed and lethal enemy.
Well, Long Tan for us really began on the night of the 17th. In the early hours of the morning, the task force was mortared. I remember that vividly.
We did not know if we were going to be attacked that night, if this was a prelude for attack. So, in fact, all of a sudden, the war had come to our own home, in our own backyard, something that I had never thought would ever happen.
The following day finds the Australians shaken. Before, danger had only ever existed outside the base. Troops are sent out to re-establish the protective cordon. At the same time, a welcome distraction arrives in the form of little Patty and Col Joy. They're here to give the men their first taste of Australian entertainment.
We all went down pretty excited and carrying on and combing our hair and all that sort of stuff, so that we looked good. We lined up and chatted to them and generally enjoyed being near famous people.
We'd experienced before that quite a few Australian audiences in Vietnam, and they were just the best. They were terrific.
As little Patty prepares for her performance, less than 500 meters away, the Viet Cong mortar position is discovered. no one is too sure of exactly what happened.
The only information that was given to us was that a small group of enemy, probably 30 to 40, had mortared the base and gone. But we were to go out and see if we could locate anything further.
We were going out to go and find out where Charlie's gone. We had no idea how many were out there. We thought, oh, well, this is going to be normal. He fired a few bombs, he shot at us, and now he's going to rack off. Shooting scooters, the Yanks used to say.
A lot of people, like before we went out, they knew that something was going to happen. It was just no one wanted to go out that particular day.
From the first day, the first patrol in Vietnam, long before the Battle of Long Tan, Australians were acutely aware that they faced a different kind of enemy. For more than 1,000 years, the Vietnamese had been forced to live under the heel of foreign invaders. In that time, they developed a repertoire of ingenious ways to combat their enemies.
I was intrigued at one stage when moving through a very lightly forested area with a good cover of leaves on the ground, that one of my soldiers started stamping his feet. And he very carefully crouched down and said, have a look at this. And he brushed away the leaves and found a piece of wire, a loop of wire in the middle. And he very carefully eased it out, looked underneath, and then lifted off this concrete lid that had earth in the top of it and leaves over it that disguised the entrance into a tunnel.
They started off as a very small spider hole, just big enough for a person my size to get down, and then underneath the ground would be developed out into chambers, and they'd have wells there, they had hospitals, they had communication centres. It was all underneath the ground and sometimes very deep. The tunnels also came in various tiers, so you might go down a tunnel that's only 6 feet from the surface of the ground, but then you'd find a trapdoor which would take you down another 6 feet, another trapdoor which would take you down another 6 feet. And some of these were crisscrossed and at right angles to each other, so they went all over the place. It reminds me of the London Underground railway system, and you could almost say that the Vietnamese took a picture out of that and painted it in Vietnam.
The soldiers, as they went through, were constantly being surprised by the Viet Cong coming out of tunnel entrances.
We'd have to be very careful how we got onto the next level, because if you put your head down and there was an enemy soldier down there, he would pike you through the throat with a steel pike, and the length of that pike was longer than the trapdoor. So if you got piked, you couldn't pull your head back up again. If he went feet first, he'd pike you through the stomach, so you couldn't get back up again.
When the Australians first came, we didn't know their intentions. Our superiors gave the order to lure them out, to learn their way of combat. The second order was to attack them.
Within minutes of entering the rubber plantation, contact is made with a small number of enemy.
I fired a couple of rounds and knocked over a bloke, and of course confusion reigned supreme for the next 3 or 4 minutes.
One of the 3 platoons pursue the fleeing Viet Cong, but they become isolated and are suddenly trapped by a large enemy force.
And all of a sudden on our left side, all hell broke loose. And we got fired on by at least 2 machine guns, a number of rifles.
There was that much noise. You couldn't hear, like you're yelling out to your mates if they were okay. But the noise was that bad.
You could not move any more than 3 or 4 metres without attracting attention. As soon as you moved, Charlie saw you and started to bloody open up.
The enemy fire, they were coming from the trees, from the ground.
Bob Buick later reported, not very long into the battle, that Gordon had been killed and that Bob had taken over command.
Gordon Sharp got hit in the throat and died instantly. That dropped me in a big bucket of shit because all of a sudden I'm looking after this crew.
There's no shoot and scoop today. The Australians are being attacked by a growing force of highly trained soldiers who already outnumber them by more than 10 to 1. In a rare move, artillery fire is called in from the Australian base. It's tricky and dangerous because these shells must fall with pinpoint accuracy from more than 4 kilometres away.
This is an element that we had never expected. Artillery to us was something that we dropped in the rear of the enemy, hoping to catch them while they were running away from a firefight. And here it was being used in an aggressive manner with visible results. And we could hear him on the phone saying, yes, I can see your fall of shot. Yes, you're in amongst them. Drop 50, move left 50, move right 100. He was directing artillery on to enemy.
Between the pauses in gunfire, strains of Little Patty's concert drift to the battlefield.
During the second show, I could sense that things were different, things were changing. I could see that officers were sort of being whisked away from the area.
Suddenly you could hear these radio calls coming in, and it was about this time the most vivid thing I remember was that Harry called, "If you don't get help out to us soon, we're all gone and you'll go next."
Ammunition is now dangerously low, and despite artillery support, the Australians are fighting for their lives.
We all got holes in our shirts and our little bush hats. There were guys being hit.
I was just talking to Shorty, and I just asked Shorty, I said, you know, where's Doug? And he said, oh, Doug's dead. And that's when I saw Shorty get hit by a big burst of automatic fire.
The men in the heat of the Battle of Long Tan were typical of Australian soldiers serving in Vietnam at that time. More than half were regular army, and the rest were national servicemen.
The most important issue in this campaign is conscription. The conscription of a section of our 20-year-old youth against their wishes and their will to kill or be killed, and the threatened extension of conscription to all...
Conscription was always a controversial issue. It was originally intended to top up a sluggish response to army recruitment, and because of concerns over Indonesia. Australian 20-year-olds were drawn at random to serve 2 years national service.
People forget just how popular was the initial commitment to Vietnam. Huge support right across the Australian community in 1965. It only started to go sour after we put conscripts in there and after the body bags started coming home with those conscripts in them.
The visit by President Johnson near the end of 1966 boosted support for the war and was overwhelmingly popular at first.
Following the Johnson demonstration, I could say that I was leaning towards an anti-war position. My good friend was constantly putting facts and figures before me, particularly things like bomb tonnages and the fact it was an undeclared war, and that we hadn't declared war on Vietnam, and that it was a war of national liberation, which I hadn't come across before. So these kinds of arguments were gradually winning me over, but my memory of things is that we were more interested in large abstract ideas like pacifism and freedom and so on, and the Vietnam War and the conscription issue were filters through which we we argued out these grander things. We were, after all, 17 and 18 years old, and solving the world's problems was one of the things that one does at that age.
The only red we want is the red we've got in the old red, white and blue. It's the brave red, got a brave red.
Vietnam was the first war in our history that didn't enjoy widespread national support. And the protesters who were making their way to the streets were not those who normally insisted on a voice.
When he heard about the conscription that he had to put his name in, he came to us and told us, he says, how'd you like the idea of me going to war? I said, oh, no. I said, not now. He says, well, if my number comes out, he said, I'll have to go. He had many of his mates who had told him what he could do to try and get out of it. But no, he said, I'm not a coward, he said, I won't do it. And then the time came then that his number had come out and he was called in. And he just come home and he says, Mum, that's it. I said, what's what? He says, I'm going away. I said, you're not. I said, where are you going? He said, to Vietnam. I said, where's Vietnam? I'd never heard of the place before. He says, oh, it's miles and miles away, he said. As far as the conscription was concerned, I didn't like the idea of it, but then again I thought the boys need training. I thought they should train, but not to send them away. I don't think they should have been sent away. Not when they were so young anyway.
Kenny Gant was one of 17,000 conscripts destined for Vietnam. They earned a reputation equal to the Australian regular soldiers for endurance and courage. Whether national serviceman or regular, the duty that greeted most soldiers was patrolling, walking the weeds, questioning and constantly searching for the enemy, an enemy that could be easily hidden by a friendly smile. It was a 24-hour war for the Australians with no defined front line, a war where even precious breaks were contaminated by enemy presence.
When we would get a day off during the day to go into Vung Tau, there was more tension because, you see, Vung Tau was used as a venue for rest and recuperation, but it wasn't only used by us, it was also used by the Viet Cong. So they would be, we know they'd be in town, and we'd be in town, so it was continual tension all the time. Even if you went to Saigon, it was exactly the same thing.
Even during our civic action program, where the medical needs of local villages were attended to, or houses and community buildings destroyed by war rebuilt, no one could be sure of their safety. But the most difficult and dangerous task was rooting out the enemy from the heart of local villages, where they had enjoyed 20 years of dominance. Almost inevitably, it seriously damaged our relationship with the South Vietnamese.
Là khóa cửa không cho tháo về, tức là ở trên 3 độ trên ép xuống, đến cuối cùng là bao.
Our intention was to completely surround the Australians, to force them into one small group. As we advanced to close the net, we wanted to kill them all. We wanted an all-out fight to strike decisively, for once and for all, for them to die or for us to die.
Off we went out through the wire. Now at this stage, you could hardly breathe. It rained so heavily up there. The rain, I think, had an incidental advantage for us because it actually masked the sound of our vehicles leaving the task force.
Enemy numbers continue to swell, and the platoon most under attack is still isolated. Only 10 of the original 28 men are now able to fight.
I'd made a decision that there's no way the company or anyone is going to come and get us. And I had to make a decision, that I've lived with all the time. You know, it's a decision I made at the time. I decided to get as many out as possible.
A dangerous rescue attempt is made but falls short when it's confronted by heavy fire.
11 Platoon's radio had been shot out. And we had now lost communications with them. There was no way of us advising 11 Platoon that we were there. I could only hope that the longer I stayed there, the longer he realised that there was no VC behind him, that must be because there were Australians behind him, so that he would then move back towards us.
Some of the guys had their grenades out in front. Some guy had a machete in his hand. He was going to take off the head of it if a Charlie came close to him. But there was absolutely nothing we could do. We'd exhausted ammunition. We had, in fact, taken as much casualties as we could. It was time to piss off.
2 helicopters loaded with life-saving ammunition make their cautious way to the battlefield.
I remember we lifted up above the trees and it was just pouring with rain. We could see the battlefield as soon as we got to the top of the rubber plantation. So we saw a road which we knew led out to Long Tan, so we turned left. So we called turn now, and they rolled on their side and all the ammunition just dropped straight down through the rubber trees over that point.
After an initial reluctance to accept this mission, the Air Force is roundly praised for their skill and daring. From the early days, the Royal Australian Air Force made its presence felt in Vietnam. Australian Caribous, affectionately known as Wallaby Airlines, were real workhorses. Australian Canberra bombers joined the Americans and flew on dangerous and successful low-level bombing missions. But it was with the Army's Special Air Service, better known as the SAS, that chopper pilots from the Australian Air Force set a new standard for teamwork in life-threatening situations.
We had occasions where people were shot at, being dropped off on the landing zones. The helicopters would return under fire and pick us up again. I had a patrol of mine where in the jungle I'd had a man shot, and so out of the 5 of us we had 2 carrying that fella, and the helicopters came and got us, and there was no landing place. We had to be winched up through the jungle whilst we were in contact with the enemy, and the door gunners were firing at the enemy directly above us as we were being winched out. With the SAS, it was just a 5-man patrol. So in your operations, you needed to take everything on your back, and within those 5 men that would sustain you for a week at a time in areas that were 30 kilometres or more away from the task force base. We had no direct air support. We had no artillery support. We were totally left to our own devices. So we became a very close-knit, highly professional group of people that through our training in New Guinea and our other long exercises in Australia, we got to know one another so well that we could almost pass messages just looking into the eyes of the person next to you and with very little facial expression.
Vietnam has been described as a 10-man war, with success favouring small patrols who fought with stealth and surprise. But Australians were also confronted by larger, more traditional conflicts. At the battles of Coral and then Balmoral, ferocious attacks by large numbers of North Vietnamese spanned a period of 26 days. In these encounters, our tanks proved their worth, and Australian artillery was heavily relied on.
Coral Balmoral, of course, was a new experience for me and my battalion. We were then pitched into the big league. We were well out of, of course, our area of Phuoc Tuy province, and we were on the approaches to Saigon. We knew that there were very large North Vietnamese forces in the area, but the extent to which we would engage them was always as part of the fog of war, I guess.
The Royal Australian Navy experienced its share as well.
Go east, 175.
Working alongside the Americans, patrolling enemy waters and supporting troops ashore with gunfire. A little-known Navy helicopter unit flew with the Americans, taking their gunships into hot landing zones to drop and protect Allied troops.
As we break out of this young rubber, there in front of us was this enormous force of enemy that the ground seemed to stand up. But just for a split second, I thought, it's D Company, There was just this momentary pause. Then the carrier on my far right, Richard Gross, said, "It's the enemy," and opened fire. We started to edge forward, is the only way I can describe it. It's a matter of firing and in some cases actually running over the people. And we kept going, and we were suddenly out of these people. Just to pause and describe, they were actually falling back to the east in good order. They were going back firing at us, covering the others as they were pulling out. I saw they were dragging their wounded, actually. They seemed to have loops or whatever around their ankles, and they were dragging their wounded out, and they were going across our front and out to the northeast. It's a pretty grim business.
And all of a sudden, amongst the noise of the machine guns and artillery, there appeared the noise of diesel engines. And here were these armoured personnel carriers coming through the gloom, guns firing, and some of my forward soldiers got up because the enemy, as soon as these tanks arrived, the enemy just turned and left. Now, there was not another shot fired. And I think a lot of my soldiers thought that they were never going to arrive and that we would never get out of it. And a lot of them stood up and went over and gave the carriers a gentle pat on the side and certainly shook hands with the Armoured Corps guys and probably some of the A Company guys that came out in the carriers.
National serviceman Kenny Gant did not greet the armoured personnel carriers. His life was lost earlier in the battle.
He's like the rest of them. He stayed there and stayed there until the death. He died at his post defending his mates.
The last memory Mother Beryl had of Kenny was when she gathered with family to say goodbye.
They were supposed to leave after midnight. So he said to me, "Mum," he said, "hang on a minute," he said, "I've got to go and get me cigarettes," he said. I said, "All right." Waited there for him and he didn't come back. And I said, "Where the devil is he?" Next thing we heard the plane leaving. The boys were all on the plane. They were taking them away. We didn't even get to say goodbye to him. I think that was the worst part of the whole deal. and I couldn't get over it. I got home, I was more like a zombie than anything, you know, with not being able to say goodbye to him. So we just had to pick up from there once he'd gone. But every time I went out in the yard and heard a plane come over, oh, I thought of Kenny all the time. I just couldn't get him out of my mind.
Another conscript who fought alongside Kenny Gant had been severely injured and presumed dead. To make it through the night, he packed his wounds with mud to stem the bleeding.
I thought, oh shit, I'm in a bit of trouble now that I'm going to be on me Pat Malone all night. So it's just a matter of trying to survive the night. And with some of the enemy coming around during the night, I just worried whether I was going to survive that as well. So when I did call out a couple of times for help, I got fired at. So I just kept quiet then and just hoped that they'd pick me up first thing in the morning.
Our job that next morning was to go and visit the injured at 36th Evac Hospital in Vung Tau. And I remember standing outside. Cole had his guitar and we were ready to go into a particular entrance of the hospital, and we were saying to each other, "How do you feel?" He said, "I'm all right, how are you?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I'm all right." But we weren't. We were feeling pretty teary and sad and propping each other up. Eventually the door opened and we went inside, and of course we didn't cry. But much later I did. And just seeing the many wounded and their young faces, you know, they all look like my brother.
Even the first day the day I woke up in bed at the hospital, I even had a dream that the same night after that, and that all the blokes in the dream were all them friends, all my mates that were killed, and I just said to them, "It's only a dream. When I wake up, you'll wake up in the morning with me." Well, that dream's kept with me from Long Tan until now. It doesn't happen every night, but it happens quite often, that I still have that same one dream about those young blokes, telling them that, you know, when I wake up, they'll wake up with me.
No matter what battle Australians were engaged in, this aerial lifeline gave even the most severely wounded soldier a chance.
As the war wore on, casualties realised that if they were badly hurt and they could survive till they got to our pad at the hospital, which was known as Vampire for some strange reason, if they made Vampire, they reckoned they had a pretty good chance of surviving. And I think probably that must have had a very good effect on the morale of the soldiers, to know that first of all they were going to be very rapidly evacuated, and then they were going to be dealt with efficiently.
There was one young man flown in with 5 bullet wounds across his chest. He was in the triage for about an hour before we really thought that he was okay to be operated on. The surgeons put in 48 units of blood in 3 points, and medical people will understand that that's a lot of blood in. It was really coming out as we were putting it in. But he was then in the operating theatre for the next 8 hours. He couldn't go out on the next evacuation to Australia. He was too ill to go. He came to after his 8 hours and, using the good Australian vernacular, spoke to the nurse and said, "Give us a kiss." So we knew there was no brain damage, but we were all a little concerned that he had had some brain damage.
It's the day after the Battle of Long Tan, and Australian troops return to the battleground. they walked through a grisly scene of devastation and waste. 108 Australians faced an enemy force of more than 2,000. Around 500 Vietnamese were killed. 18 Australians died.
We were trying to kill people, and let's face it, it's one of those sort of things that is extremely difficult to kill another human, but you're trained psychologically and everything to do it. What they don't train you for is when you've got to go back into a battlefield.
10% of our emotions were the thrill of the victory, and you could see the devastation. You could say, we won, we won. But 90% was this letdown, this awful dread that what we were witnessing, not that we had caused it, because most of it, we weren't witnessing people that we had actually shot. We knew that artillery had fallen or someone else in the company had shot them or something. It wasn't a personal guilt, but it was just an overwhelming dread of just loss.
I was not prepared to handle bodies late in the day that were fly blown. You'd grab hold of an arm and you'd pull him into a hole and the arm would come off and his whole body would be full of maggots. For days after, you can't get the stench. If you handle someone that's dead, you can't get the stench off your hands. And if you're a smoker like I was in those days, every time you lit up a cigarette, you could smell death. It's another one of those things you can't explain. If you've witnessed it and been there and done it, you remember it. But then you try not to remember it. And this is the whole thing. I have been trying not to remember. And I think we all do that.
You have an image in your head, that guy, he will never hold his kids on his lap. He'll never have a Sunday lunch with mum and dad again. You just sense the loss. And that's just undescribable. I'm probably not making a good go of it now, but that's the way it is. It's just an undescribable loss that you feel on that person's behalf. And you see it once, and it doesn't get better the second time, and it doesn't get better the third time.
If there was any time that exposed Vietnam as a war influenced by the media, it was on this day. It was the Buddhist holiday of Tet in 1968. The Viet Cong, with little regard for their own lives, attacked more than 100 cities and towns across the country. On paper, it was not a victory for the North Vietnamese, but the television reports delivered to lounge rooms across the world exposed the futility and the unvarnished horror of the war.
Tet, in January of '68, said everything that needs to be said about the media's influence on the Vietnam War. Militarily, the Americans insisted that they won, and I suppose they did. But not from the images that came from television. The storming of the embassy in Saigon. The penetration of all the main cities of the South, and a lot of their big military bases as well. Huge defeat, but all carried on television that absolutely was the denial of what the military authorities were saying about we won Tet. They didn't win Tet. Tet was the beginning of the end of the war.
These images made it clear that despite the assurances of imminent victory from American generals, this war was far from being over. The shuttle homeward of dead Australian soldiers would continue. Tet was a devastating blow to popular American support of the war. The Vietnam War would drag on for another 4 years. But within weeks, American bombing of North Vietnam paused, and plans for an American withdrawal began. Australia would follow.
We need numbers and more numbers to get up and cry out, to march in the street.
Clearly, they will keep killing our Vietnamese as long as we keep killing them.
Perhaps inevitably, the protest movement in Australia followed the American model as faithfully as the Australian government followed American policy.
Imperialist troops! All imperialist troops!
Despite our troops' consistent and courageous victories, the war had been lost. Australian soldiers were ordered home. In the province of Phuoc Tuy, the heart of our major successes for more than 5 years, control fell to the Viet Cong as soon as our soldiers returned to Australia.
I was doing a guard on the cenotaph in Martin Place. They used to mount the army mounted a guard there every Thursday. And I was on that guard when someone out of the crowd, as I'm in the middle of a rest on arms reverse, which is probably the crucial memorial stage of the job that we were doing there, and someone walked out and spat in my face. I was tempted to pick up the rifle butt and hit the person. Right? I didn't, and I stood there, and I just didn't feel like a soldier. I didn't feel that I had done my duty for my country like everybody else had, like my grandfather, my father before me, and so forth. It was the greatest insult that could have occurred.
After a very short time in Sydney, I went down to Melbourne, and my father took me to his return services club, and I'd been asked to tell them about my experiences, and I did that. And the old diggers said that wasn't a war, that I didn't know what a war was. And I was just devastated. I never joined the RSL after that. I came away and just couldn't cope with it. It was bad enough with the civilians, but to have the old diggers say that was terrible. So I got back after my leave and got into the army and went on with my training. And I inevitably went back and did another tour. And we had the same thing happen again. I think the protesters were really misdirected. They should have been taking out their anger on the government, and we could have accepted that. But to have them doing it to the soldiers, that's inexcusable. And they should forever feel ashamed because of that.
Frankie drinking tinnies in the Grand Hotel on a 36-hour rec leave in Vung Tau. And I can still hear Frankie lying screaming in the jungle till the morphine came and killed the bloody row. And the Anzac legends didn't mention mud and blood and tears. And the stories that my father told me never seemed quite real. I caught some pieces in my back that I didn't even feel. God help me, I was only 19. And can you tell me, doctor, why I still can't get to sleep? And why the Channel 7 chopper chills me to my feet? And what's this rash that comes and goes? Can you tell me what it means? God help me. I was only 19.